And I think Donald Trump wrestled with that because obviously his donors want him to do that. And he's the prisoner of his donors to a large extent because they put him into the White House. You can't ignore them. But on the other hand, he really doesn't want a war. So he opted for what I think, in retrospect, will be seen as more of a PR stunt.
So Douglas Macgregor was recently on Deep Dive with Daniel Davis, and he talked a little bit about why the war between Israel and Iran isn't quite over yet, and what the lessons are that we can take from it, how it impacts foreign policy from a U.S. perspective and the Trump administration, and what's to come next. So let's watch, let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
First of all, everybody over the age of 50, with very few exceptions, watches what I call boomer TV.
That's
and they will believe whatever this man says. I mean, that's the simple fact. Now, I think it's very, very ill-advised for a president of the United States to claim that a war is over when it has only just begun. Now, he may well believe that. That's a possibility. I can't imagine it because I think we're at the start of a much longer period of conflict. Now, how long it will last and what the outcome will be, I don't know. But to make that statement strikes me as walking out on the very edge and trying to jump across the chasm, on the assumption that you're going to make it in one leap. I just don't think so. So that's the first thing. I wouldn't have said it. But then again, this is vintage Donald Trump. Secondly, his description of what actually happened is very confusing and incoherent. First of all, it's not true. I think that's the most important thing to mention. And that's...
So he seems to be referring to the press conference that took place today, saying that the attack that the United States did on the Iranian nuclear facilities essentially took out their nuclear weapon program, which indeed doesn't seem to be the case. Also, there's only a ceasefire, and both sides seem to have violated it already to some extent, and there hasn't really been any change in terms of policies or ramifications for either country here, other than that this killed innocent Israelis and innocent Iranians. So you still have the uranium moved out, at least from one of the facilities prior to this strike, and now Iran has unlimited incentive to develop nuclear weapons. Why wouldn't you after what Israel and the United States did? So let's continue to listen to Macgregor.
That's something a president should avoid. You just don't want to be caught in a position of saying something that is not necessarily true. Sometimes I get the impression that President Trump says things and believes that he can wish them into reality. If he says it boldly and long enough, then ultimately it will come true. But that's rarely how it works in international relations. So we did not destroy the nuclear development capability. That's nonsense. It's now well established. And again, Boomer TV will tell you, yeah, it's absolutely done and wonderful, and we're on our ways the up and up, but it's not.
Yeah, I said this in a different video, but part of me really wants the Trump administration to celebrate this as a propaganda victory, to say that, yeah, we've destroyed their nuclear weapons program, such that this doesn't rear its ugly head up again and serve as the impetus for more U.S. intervention in Iran, more bailing out Netanyahu every time he wants to start what he wants to end as a regime change war, as I believe he did here. And, but part of me really just looks at the past and sees this vicious cycle of war propaganda for what it is, and sees that the neocons and the military-industrial complex and Netanyahu will raise this again. Iran will be weeks away from acquiring a nuclear weapon in the future. But if this narrative prevails and they can successfully sell it, maybe it won't. I'm all about truth here, but I actually think it's better for the anti-war cause for people to believe that this did erase the nuclear weapons program. But we still stand on truth here, and we know this, was counterintuitive, and it really encourages Iran to militarize in terms of defense more and potentially develop a nuclear weapon. Like I said before, it also sours our relationship overseas. It shows that America is willing to tank its own foreign policy goals for the sake of Israel. And originally the goal was to negotiate with Iran. Now that seems to be just, kind of a utopian prospect.
So I wish I could say something good along the lines of God bless the president. He's done a great job and we're off to the races, but we're not.
Yeah, Doug, they are hammering home that narrative of success, complete success, obliteration, and he even went further. And obviously, he was asked about that today, and he went further discussing. In fact, so many of the different parts of the administration, whether it be Witkoff, whether it be Marco Rubio, whether it be Hegseth, they're all saying, in fact, very little different things, but all details they're getting into as to how things unfolded and the success that they had. But let's go back to the commander-in-chief and what he had to say about what transpired.
Is there any indication from U.S. intelligence that Iran was able to move any material, including
No, we just the
uranium?
opposite. We think we hit them so hard and so fast they didn't get to move. And if you knew about that material, it's very hard and very dangerous to move. It's called in many people they call it dust, but it's very, very heavy. It's very, very hard to move. And they were way down. They're 30 stories down. They're literally 30, 35 stories down underground.
I think you got it all.
Oh yeah, we think we think it's covered with granite, concrete, and steel.
Though many other media reports and Iranian press releases have suggested that a lot of it was moved from Fordo weeks prior to this strike. And, this story's been in the news long before this transpired. Actually, the thought that Israel was going to strike Iran was in the news months and months ago. So it would have tipped Iran off to do this precaution. But there are satellite images around Fordo showing many large vehicles lined up in a row, weeks prior to this that seem to have moved the uranium out of there, or it's very highly likely that a lot of it was moved. So let's see what Macgregor says too.
Doug, they're getting into the details more and more as they go along here to finalize this narrative, it seems.
Well, it's not going to make any difference because the narrative is going to be exploded in the future. We know that those sites were effectively empty. Now, did the Iranians with 2 hours notice manage that? I don't think so. I think that the intelligence committee was either blindsided or we just ignored it. President Trump has a habit, which is, by the way, not unique to him. LBJ engaged in this sort of thing. I think you've got to accept the fact that if he doesn't like it, it doesn't fit his agenda, that he'll simply, hand wave it off. And I think that's what happened. He decided to believe whatever the Israelis provided, I suspect, through their minions in the White House. And he said, fine, let's go do this. It didn't make any difference. And it hasn't ended the war. It hasn't stopped anything. Those are the facts.
Yeah, and I think he's right about it going to rear its ugly head again. And I wouldn't even be surprised if it's people from this presidential administration that bring this up in the future, like breaking news. We found that Iran was able to get a lot of the enriched uranium out of there and restart its nuclear program for more war propaganda. Netanyahu especially will do that. The neocons will do that. That will serve as a new pretext for militarism against Iran. Trust me, this is going to come back to haunt the U.S. because it really just encouraged Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. There's supposedly a fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini not to develop a nuclear weapon. That could be for optics. He might change his mind on this, or his successor might change his mind on this because they see that the U.S. isn't exactly messing with North Korea after Bush said it was part of the axis of evil, but they did mess, and by mess I mean overthrowing a coup and murder by funding the rebellion in Libya of Gaddafi after he had given up his nuclear weapons program in the mid-2000s.
Now, there's something else. An old friend of mine who is now retired, who served in Vietnam as well as in Desert Storm, and then subsequently retired in the late 1990s. He called me immediately and he said, as soon as the president or anyone else stands up and starts to tell you our great servicemen and our military and on, how great they are, and they're the best. He said, immediately step back. He says, you're about to listen to a load of bull. And what they're interested in doing is distracting everyone from what actually happened.
Yeah, totally agree with this. Both Hegseth and Trump did this when they took questions at times regarding the movement of uranium and whether they destroyed it all. Hegseth immediately launched into oratory praising the courage of U.S. forces in these missions and stuff. And that was truly a deflection. It was sidestepping the actual questions. by, acting and responding as if they had somehow undermined the courageous might of the U.S. military or whatever. It was very transparent to see this if you watch that press conference, that many of the tangibles were obscured by, this rah-rah celebration of the troops. And, that's part of the narrative.
And how many times have you listened to Hegseth, Rubio, Trump, over and over and over? Wow, no one else could have done this. We're the greatest, and on and on.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. We have an old expression, nonsense talks, but performance walks. And
That's a nice way of saying it.
I think this is a mistake to do what he's done. But whatever. I think we're at war with Iran. That's not over. Iran is still at war with Israel. Israel is absolutely at war with Iran, and for that matter, increasingly the whole Muslim world.
Yeah, the real threat here is who decides to share nuclear technology with Iran, even if they did destroy a lot of the enrichment process or the enriched uranium or kind of the infrastructure that they need to enrich it. Who's to say Iran doesn't develop more weaponry and more apprehension toward the U.S. and Israel? Certainly has to after this whole foray. Even when backed into the corner, they were remarkably restrained. But who says they're going to be that way again, especially if there's, more of a bombing campaign against city center areas such as in Tehran. Israel did hit some places in Tehran, but if the U.S. unleashes weapons there, who knows what's going to happen? And I don't want it to be, a bloodbath next time, because they actually have developed nukes because of their experiences in this facade.
Doug, you said something. You said it quickly, and I'm afraid that it's getting glossed over. It sure stood out to me, and it still stands out to me how Trump took the advice or took the intel from Israel, completely ignoring, at least from what we can tell on the surface, his own intel, his own intelligence community. How much does that bother you?
Well, it's not surprising. As I said, LBJ did that sort of thing. Several presidents have. A good example of someone who didn't, interestingly enough, is Richard Nixon. He talked to Kissinger. This is before the strategic arms limitations talks and before we completed any of the agreements that emerged from those talks on arms control. And Nixon asked Kissinger, what do you think? Do you think this is real? And they were looking at the intelligence assessments that had been provided by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Kissinger said, I'm not confident they're accurate. Now, these painted a picture that was not only ominous for the whole world based upon what they were imputing to the Soviets, but it turned out that it also was largely inaccurate. So Nixon said, well, listen, let's check this. And Kissinger said, I'll do it. So what Kissinger did, which I think was very, very smart, is that he brought to Washington the station chiefs across Eastern Europe and in Central Asia that were, Turkey in particular, that were watching everything that the Soviets did in terms of their nuclear stockpile and nuclear weapons development. Brought them to the White House. They got into a room with Kissinger and they came out with a completely different assessment. And ultimately, the result was the strategic arms limitation talk. So in that case, Kissinger and Nixon recognized this is not necessarily the director of the CIA lying in that case. It was more a question of the status quo bureaucracy in Langley that produced one answer, and the answer that came from the field where people dealt with this every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was different. But you're talking about Nixon and Kissinger. They wanted to achieve something, with the Russians, and they were absolutely determined that they were going to find a way to do it, and they were smart enough to question, whatever came out of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, they ultimately did come up with an agreement, the SALT I Treaty, which limited the number of nuclear delivery vehicles between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think that was in 71 or 72. And that stood until the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from it. It's one of the things that inflamed tensions with Russia that doesn't get talked about enough. I know Jeffrey Sachs mentions that a lot, but he's right about this. And yeah, it's a real horror show to pay attention to Mossad intelligence on Iran in comparison to your own, especially when your own is saying that not only are they not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and by the way, they're compliant all the time under the JCPOA inspections, but also that there's no evidence that they reconstituted their program. That whole idea that they did, and somehow all of a sudden they're weeks away, conveniently came one day before the U.S. launched its strike and seemed to have completely contradicted what Tulsi Gabbard said about this just 7 weeks ago. This wasn't even a few years ago. This is 7 weeks ago that Tulsi Gabbard said all the things I just said.
Now, in this case, President Trump decided he didn't like what he was being told, and he was going to go ahead and do what he thought was appropriate. And I think he placed a lot of trust and confidence in what the Mossad said.
And at the same time, demoralizing his own team.
What do you mean team?
What
team? What team is he demoralized?
Oh, I just let's say the Tulsi Gabbard, the CIA. I mean, go down the list of the Larry.
Wait a minute. Don't assume that Radcliffe had any problems with this. I think you've got to go and look at Blumenthal's most recent article where he talks about Radcliffe as the Mossad stenographer.
Yeah, Max Blumenthal, he's referring to his article where the Gray Zone got a scoop that Radcliffe was essentially the facilitator of Mossad, putting Mossad agents in those briefing rooms with Trump to try to twist him in the direction of regime change. It's spooky stuff, but take a look at Max Blumenthal's article on this that he's referencing. It's excellent.
Sitting in the CIA. No, I think we've got a lot of people who are compromised. And that's just one example. I think probably the only person that pushed back at all was Tulsi Gabbard.
Right.
And
but only for a while, right?
Well, I mean, you've got to make a decision. Are you going to push back and then make this an existential decision? Either you believe me, or if you don't and you press ahead with this, I can't support it, I resign. Or do you say, whoops, okay, boss, I'll stay on board. And apparently she decided to stay on board.
I think that's likely. You can't ignore the testimony that contradicted her earlier testimony, what she posted on Twitter the day before the bombings. They're suddenly weeks away out of nowhere. That, according to Max Blumenthal, is from Israeli intelligence, which, by the way, Netanyahu didn't even go that far. In his only interview that I saw after the Israeli strike, he said that Iran's probably 12 months or maybe 13 months away. So, yeah, it's hard to know exactly what happened, but there's certainly compromised elements of our deep state and people that were advising these decisions. And we know that there were, because we came dangerously close to launching that regime change. If the Iranians didn't have restraint, I think that would have happened, and that would have been the worst case scenario.
Yeah, it was no hill for her to die on, I guess. Let me flesh it out a little bit more, because Trump explains even more his thinking and what all is going on and what he foresees going forward with Iran in this case.
Are you interested in restarting negotiations with Iran? And if so, have they reciprocated?
So our people, Marco could answer this, but our people are not. I'm not. The way I look at it, they fought, the war's done, and I could get a statement that they're not going to go nuclear. We're probably going to ask for that, but they're not going to be doing it. But they're not going to be doing it anyway. They've had it.
Yeah, that seems like a very convenient way to evade what was a successful JCPOA that they were complying with and abiding with for 3 years before Trump threw it away. Probably the only good foreign policy accomplishment that Obama ever made, as far as, from a non-interventionist standpoint and from a normalizing relationships around the world standpoint. So much so that Netanyahu hated it, the Israel lobby hated it, and the neocons hated it. So, it sucks if we're not going to try to negotiate for another arrangement of that kind, but it does seem to be the case that Trump's disinterested in that. Maybe he truly believes that they took out all this nuclear weaponry, but even then, it would still benefit both, the United States and Israel if the objective really is to curtail their nuclear weapons development, to sign on to this thing.
Doug, when I hear that, it's almost like he's declaring their surrender for them. And it's like, well, that dog don't hunt.
Well, the Israelis fully expected that Iran would collapse within the first 24 to 72 hours under the weight of their initial airstrikes. And
hammering, yeah.
Then Ben-Gvir, a few days later, admitted publicly what nobody in the Israeli government or anywhere in the Israeli media would admit, which is, gosh, we underestimated the Iranian arsenal. We didn't appreciate it.
Do you think that though, or do you think that they underappreciated it and knew that, such that they were counting on the U.S. to come in, bail them out, and hopefully execute a regime change? I think there might have been some deliberate action in all of this. It's true that that could be right, and both things could be right to some extent. It could be a mix of both, but I'm not sure it was just that they were, they misjudged the amount of weaponry Iran has.
And that's why they came to us immediately, said, you've got to get into this war. You've got to bail us out. You've got to help us. And I think Donald Trump wrestled with that because obviously his donors want him to do that. And he's the prisoner of his donors to a large extent because they put him into the White House. You can't ignore them. But on the other hand, he really doesn't want a war. So he opted for what I think in retrospect will be seen as more of a PR stunt, a staged event, political theater, call it whatever you want. And these strikes, were announced before we went in. We told them we were coming in 2 hours. There was no, as far as I can tell, pushback from the integrated air defense systems. No missiles were fired. I don't know if they turned their radars on or not. I'm sure they have the radar cross-section target form for the B-2s and everything else anyway. They're not a secret and haven't been for a while. So I don't know, but I think that's basically what happened. And what's dangerous now is that he's imputing to this a steady state outcome. Right. The truth is, and he let it slip very briefly. If you listen to the remarks, well, it could happen again. In other words, this could break out again. Yeah, it could break out tomorrow. It could break out in 6 weeks. It could break out in 2 months. We don't know.
Yeah, that's true. And the neocons and Netanyahu will continue to clamor for it. Suddenly, I wonder if Vegas is taking odds on how long it's going to be until Netanyahu says, again, Iran's a few weeks from developing a nuclear weapon. Or, Vegas should take odds on that. That would be something that's good to bet on, I guess. But yeah, he's right. Ultimately, the military part of this did play out like a PR stunt where Trump announced this strike. He did this strike. And then the Iranians practiced restraint. They tipped Trump off to the fact that they were going to fire some missiles, but they did it in a way to minimize the chance that they would do any damage to U.S. troops. And don't get me wrong, it's not a PR stunt in the context that hundreds of innocent Iranians and Israelis died in this whole thing, which amounted to nothing. It shouldn't have been a military operation to begin with, and really Israel's strike was a fool's errand. It also seems like a setback in so many ways for what he's talking about. This might not be over, and, it just gives the Iranians incentive to rearm and develop nukes, I think, going forward.
And right now, we know that the Israelis are running out of cash and missiles. And I'm sure we're trying to send them everything we possibly can. By the way, we have fired hundreds of missiles from our destroyers in support of the Israelis and their air defense against incoming Iranian missiles. We're about out. Our ships have to go back to port to reload. I know that our THAAD battery on the ground has had to fire virtually everything it has. There was an article that came out, I think, within the last 24 hours in a trade magazine where a representative from Raytheon admitted that we've got a real problem with rocket motors, and it affects certain classes of missiles. I think it's the Standard Missile 2, Standard Missile 6, can't remember, also AMRAAM, a number of missiles out there. Well, that's because we don't manufacture the rocket motors. We manufacture components. We're dependent on external sources for the rest of it. And he was simply saying, I don't think we can do much quickly. And then we had this business of 600 missiles a year. We've managed to increase that to 660 a year that we can manufacture. Listen, that's not going to work. We want to be a great power. We want to be a superpower. Trump likes to grandstand about that. Well, I better find out what happened to the manufacturing base. When are we going to build a manufacturing base that can keep up? That's something the Russians and the Chinese don't have a problem with. We've got a serious problem with it. So all of these statements are ill-advised, these public statements from him, in my judgment.
Yeah, we'll have to see if some of these statements come to bite him back in the face, or will he embrace them when it's time to drum up anti-Iranian propaganda again? Because this is nothing new. Anti-Iranian propaganda's been around forever. They'll wipe Israel off the map. the death to America chants. Oh my gosh, have you seen what they chant? And, without corresponding actions or attacks against the United States in any way. They were remarkably restrained, unlike everything the neocons had told you about the Iranian regime, even when they were kind of pushed back into the corner after both U.S. and Israeli strikes. After both of those countries had Iran in their crosshairs, they didn't behave that way. So, yeah, there's a lot of questions that come from this, and if this is truly ended, whether, missiles will just resume firing on either side sometime soon. We're in a ceasefire, not an end agreement. There hasn't been, kind of any armistice document drawn up or signed. This could go the way of North Korea and South Korea in some ways. Of course, thankfully, that hasn't been a hot war between the two countries in a long time, but that's technically a ceasefire too.
Doug, I'm curious. How common or uncommon is it in the course of history of making announcements of the strikes that you're going to be making? And here it happened on both sides.
Yeah.
You're saying the Iranians did it. Well, I think they did it as a courtesy to us.
Right.
You have to remember we are the ones that struck first. And we are the ones backing the Israelis. We are the ones that have opted for war with Iran. Iran's not interested in a war with us.
Right.
And the Iranian leadership from day one has done everything in its power to avoid provoking us in any way.
They really have, contrary to all the war propaganda that you've heard about this time and time again. He's so right.
I think their attitude has been, let's not give the Americans an excuse to do even more than they're already doing for the Israelis.
For sure.
So let's back off as much as we possibly can. I still think that's their view. They will do everything they can to avoid attacking us, avoid any kind of collision with us. And so they picked out Qatar, which they knew was evacuated. That was one of the first places we evacuated. They picked the base. They told us we're going to go in there. They gave us a warning. We went in, destroyed everything, and then they left. Okay. In other words, it's tit for tat. I think you'll always see that from the Iranians. They're not interested in a war with us. And that's very good, because if President Trump were very, very clever, he would exploit that to avoid being drawn in even more into Israel's war, as I said, not just with Iran, but with the whole Muslim world.
Do you think they're humbled enough, Doug, that they won't be as aggressive trying to re-enrich uranium as time goes forward?
I think they will have a nuclear weapon quite soon.
Yeah, I have to agree. If this incident doesn't encourage them to do that, I don't know what would.
And the reason I say that is that the lesson of all of this is that if you have a nuclear weapon, the United States and its friend Israel don't attack you.
So true.
So the incentive now to build a nuclear weapon is greater than it's ever been.
Right.
Yeah.
And remember, we always had the option of embracing the idea of a nuclear-free zone in the whole Middle East that everybody would sign up for except Israel. Israel's special. Never forget that. Israel deserves everything. No one else deserves anything.
Including the entire U.S. Treasury. Indeed, JFK tried to prevent Israel from acquiring nuclear weapons. There's correspondence between him and David Ben-Gurion, and correspondence to the Dimona facility, which was the heart of that program, from what I understand. And shortly after that, he got killed in murky circumstances where many people, including this guy, think the CIA was involved. So that's what happens. And Iran is willing to embrace a nuclear-free Middle East, despite, again, all the propaganda that they're just nuclear genocidal madmen. They want a nuclear-free Middle East, but guess who doesn't? It's Israel, the only power in that region with a nuke. I guess Pakistan, if you consider that, but Pakistan's technically in Asia, I think. So that's where we're at. Israel is the only country allowed to have a secret nuclear weapons program. They don't admit it, such that they won't be subject to any inspections or any IAEA regulation whatsoever.
And the Israeli position is we have to have these. It all begins with the Holocaust narrative, runs all the way through the 50s, 60s. In fact, in 1952, the Israelis began the process of trying to build nuclear weapons immediately. They wanted them. They felt they had to have them. But remember, it also confers an ability on Israel to, frankly, bully their neighbors. I mean, if you know that your little neighbor next door can march in, do a lot of damage on a conventional level, that's one thing. But if you fight back and you, for instance, manage to win on the battlefield, then you have to reckon that the nuclear weapons will be used against you. So they're not willing to give up this monopoly. That's a monopoly in the region. And that's also the foundation for hegemony. And that's what they want. And that's not just they. We'll talk about that in the future, about what else all of this means in the region, because the banking interests in New York City and the City of London are very interested in the outcome, just as they've been very interested in trying to destroy Russia. Now it's Iran. That's related. But I think we have to understand these things are connected. And now I think the game is up. You will see nuclear weapons in the hands of other countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that might be the worst negative ramification of this if your goal is, again, to limit the spread of nuclear weapons to more powers throughout the world, not just in the Middle East, because the whole world has access to the news for the most part. There's places like North Korea that are very isolated and they don't get a lot of that information, but most places in the world do. And all eyes are on this, to see what the results of this were and what it means. And really what it means is that we're going to mess with powers that don't have nuclear weapons if it's in the interest of Israel. Now, the moment they get nuclear weapons, it would be a massive disincentive for the U.S. to mess with them. That's why you don't see the U.S. continually flirting with regime change in North Korea. Some of the most diehard neocons used to do that. You don't hear that much of it more because it's just impossible to sell that war propaganda. But it was possible to sell it to some extent in this theater because they didn't have nuclear weapons. According to Netanyahu, they've been on the cusp of that for 30 years. Since I was a child, they've been weeks away from acquiring nukes. And those articles even go back to the 80s. So this is going to go on. Netanyahu's going to clamor about it again. If Macgregor's right, he could be. Iran's going to eventually acquire nuclear weapons. But even in that case, I don't think the biggest risk is an Iranian attack using nuclear weapons. I think it would actually be an Israeli attack using nuclear weapons, because the Iranians know that a nuclear strike against Israel will mean utter annihilation and the doom of the regime there. So, we'll have to see what comes from this, but let me know in the comments below. Do you agree with Macgregor about what he said, the ramifications of this, how Trump acted, who is trying to manipulate him, etc.? I want to hear from you on that. Let me know. Please subscribe to Daniel Davis, great podcast he has. Like this video, subscribe to my channel as well. Please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support me. I'd really appreciate your support. It would help a lot. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll talk to you in the next one.